Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Now, The Hellbound Heart was published in 1986, and this was first published as a novella in a collection called Night Visions. Later on, it was published as a standalone novel, and this was also the basis for the 1987 horror classic Hellraiser, which kickstarted the Hellraiser film franchise. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the film adaptation of this book and its subsequent sequels at the end of this review. Now, I first read this book in high school, and I actually did do a review of this book a couple of years ago, but I recently took down my old review and now I'm re-reviewing it. Now, The Hellbound Heart was my first Clive Barker novel, but after I read this, I did go on to check out more of Clive Barker's stories. Now, Clive Barker has also written books like Weave World, Cold Heart Canyon, Mr. Begone, Cabal, and the Books of Blood series. And arguably, The Hellbound Heart might actually be his most famous work, probably because of the film adaptation. Now, Clive Barker, I think, is one of the most important voices in modern horror literature. Now, he might not be as famous as Stephen King, but I honestly think Clive Barker goes places in his stories that I really do think Stephen King is afraid to go, and that's not me ragging on Stephen King, because if you know me, you know I'm a diehard Stephen King fan, but I honestly think Stephen King would be the first person to admit that. Now, the plot of The Hellbound Heart is it's about this man named Frank Cotton who is pretty much a thrill seeker, and he's an adventurer, and he's also kind of a sexual deviant, and what happens is he's just become so jaded and so bored and so desensitized to his life, pretty much. Like, he's dabbled in just about every different sexual perversion you could think of, and he's just become bored by all of it. Like, he's become so sexually desensitized, so he's looking for the ultimate experience in sexual pleasure. And during his travels, he's heard rumors of this magic puzzle box, and supposedly if you solve the puzzle correctly, it would open the gateway to another dimension, possibly even heaven or hell, and it will summon these interdimensional beings called the Cenobites, and supposedly the Cenobites will give you the ultimate experience in pleasure. Eventually, Frank gets his hands on the puzzle box, and he takes it back to his home, and he solves the puzzle and opens the gateway to this other dimension, and he summons the Cenobites. But the Cenobites end up giving him a lot more than he bargained for. The Cenobites end up giving him the ultimate experience in pleasure and pain, and they end up killing him and taking his soul back to their realm, which is either hell or some hell-like dimension. They also destroy his body and hide what's left of his body in the wall of the room where he died. The book then jumps ahead to 1 year later, and it starts following Frank's brother Rory and his wife Julia, and they move into the house which was Frank and Rory's family home, and unbeknownst to them is also the same house where Frank died. Now, in the book, you find out that prior to Rory and Julia's wedding, Julia actually had an affair with Frank, and over the years, she has realized that she actually loves Frank and has actually grown to hate Rory. And then one day, shortly after moving into the house, Rory accidentally cuts himself, and then he bleeds on the floor of the room where Frank died, and his blood getting on the floor somehow summons the spirit of Frank from this other dimension, which, as I said before, may or may not be hell, and then Frank actually comes back from the dead as a zombie. Eventually, Julia finds Frank, and Frank tells her that in order to become regenerated again, he needs more blood. So while Rory is out working, Julia goes out and she starts luring men to the house to kill them so Frank can feed feed on their blood. And that's the basic plotline of the Hellbound Heart, but eventually Rory's friend Kirsty ends up getting dragged into this as well. Now, the Hellbound Heart is an excellent book, and if you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. And one of the things that's really impressive about this book really is the writing style, because a lot of the prose in this novel are actually kind of poetic in a way, and kind of lyrical, and it's the kind of writing style that you would see in classical literature, and that's something that Clive Barker does really well, is he combines the writing style of classical literature with more of a modern day writing style as well. Another thing I really like about this book really is the characters. The characters in this book are very three-dimensional, especially Frank and Julia. Even though Frank and Julia are the villains of the story, they're still very three-dimensional characters, and I don't want to say you necessarily sympathize with them, but you almost understand them. Like, their desires are very human desires. Even though Frank is not exactly a human anymore, he still comes off as a very human character. And don't get me wrong, he's a bad character, like, he's a bad guy, but at the same time, though, he is very three-dimensional. In some ways, I would almost say that the characters of Rory and Kirsty, who are arguably the protagonists of the novel, well, they're the characters who aren't necessarily evil. They're actually kind of underdeveloped compared to Frank and Julia, who are the evil characters in the book. I don't know if that was done on purpose or not, but that actually kind of works in the book's favor, that the characters who are most three-dimensional are actually the bad guys. And I do think there's a really interesting shade of grey with all the characters in this book. Even Rory and Kirsty, who are depicted as being good people, there's even a shade of grey with these characters. The characters in the book, once again, I would say in general are very three-dimensional, and they're just very human characters. Like, I think this story, even though it does deal with the supernatural and the otherworldly, it's still a very human story. Despite the fact that it's also very nihilistic, there's still something very human about this story. But this is also very much a book about people doing horrible things to each other just to achieve their own personal gratification. The book is also very much about the thin line between pain and pleasure, and it's also about the thin line between romantic love and sexual love. And the book is also sort of a commentary on relationships in some way, and in this book you have this really complex, almost four-sided love triangle, where you have Kirsty, who is actually in love with Rory, but Rory is in love with Julia, but Julia actually hates Rory and is in love with Frank. But you get the idea that Frank really doesn't love Julia, he's only using Julia as a means to an end, and he really only loves himself. So I thought that was really interesting how each character in this book loves somebody else, but they're not getting any love in return. They're only getting what they perceive as love. The book is also very much about desensitization, and what happens when we become too desensitized, especially sexually desensitized. And you have the character of Frank, who is just so dissatisfied with every sexual pleasure that he's ever experienced, and that's why he summons the Cenobites, because he's looking for the ultimate experience, but of course he ends up getting way more than he bargained for, and realizing, no, this is not what I wanted. Like, it's almost as if every character in this book has a void to fill, but the thing is, though, the the way these characters fill their voids is at the expense of other human beings. And of course, I really can't talk about this book without also talking about the Cenobites, who really have become very iconic characters, even though in this book the Cenobites are really only minor characters. They only show up a few times in the story, and they're almost not even characters, they're more so ciphers to sort of move the plot along. And one thing I find really interesting about the Cenobites in this book is there's a lot you can interpret with these characters, and there's a lot about the mythology of this book that really is left open to the reader's interpretation. Like, the book very much implies that the Cenobites are actually demons from hell, but hell in this book is described as being another dimension, or another plane of existence, which, truth be told, I always believed that if there is a hell, that is what hell would be. Hell would be another dimension. Hell wouldn't be, like, located underground or something. Hell would be another dimension. It would be another plane of existence. But there's also sort of the implication that maybe they're not actually demons. Like, maybe this dimension that they're from is only a dimension that we as humans would interpret as hell, but maybe the Cenobites are actually these alien beings from another dimension that is almost like hell, but it's not hell exactly. In that sense, if you interpret the story that way, in a way the Cenobites are very Lovecraftian. But I also sort of got the implication, both from this book and the first Hellraiser movie, I also sort of got the implication that maybe the Cenobites are actually angels, or like avenging angels, because I really don't view the Cenobites as being necessarily evil. They're only acting according to their nature, and in a lot of ways they're just trying to rid the world of a horrible person like Frank. So once again, you could interpret the Cenobites as being possibly angels, or even maybe the religions have got it wrong, and maybe heaven and hell are a lot closer than we think, and perhaps even God and Satan are a lot closer than we think. Like, there are so many different ways you can interpret the mythology of this story. And also, maybe heaven and hell are subjective. What's heaven to one person might not be heaven to another person, and the book very much makes you think about these questions, so in that sense I do think it's a very thought-provoking story. And in this book, in all the scenes that involve the Cenobites, there's also mention of another being called the Engineer, who you get the idea is sort of working behind the scenes and is sort of the Cenobites' puppet master. Now, if you do interpret the Cenobites as being demons from hell, perhaps the Engineer is actually the devil. And that's something I love about the mythology of both this book and the first Hellraiser movie, is the mythology is so ambiguous, and unfortunately in the later sequels to Hellraiser, they made it much more obvious that the Cenobites are from hell, whereas once again, in the original film and in this novel, it's all very much left open to the reader's interpretation. Now, in 1987, this book was adapted into the film Hellraiser, which Barker also wrote and directed. Now, you would think that since the movie was written and directed by the same person who wrote the book, you would think that the movie would be really true to the book, but actually the movie does change quite a bit from the original novel. For example, in the book, Frank, Rory, and Julia are in their, like, late 20s or early 30s, so they're relatively young people, but in the movie the characters are much older. And also, for some reason in the movie, Clive Barker changes Rory's name to Larry. Also, the movie completely changes the character of Kirsty, because in the book, Kirsty was just a friend of Rory who was only a few years younger than him, whereas in the movie, Kirsty is actually Larry's daughter, which of course completely changes the character dynamic between these two characters. and where the book was sort of a commentary on relationships, and it was about these already complex relationships being affected by these outside supernatural forces, the movie was more so a commentary on family, and it was about this family being torn apart by these supernatural forces. So the movie does change the characters a little bit, and also some of the events in the movie happen differently than they happened in the book, but other than that though, I will say the movie Hellraiser stayed true to the general themes of the novel, and I would say in general it stayed true to the basic events of the novel. The movie also changes the Cenobites a little bit, whereas in the book, the Cenobites were very much described as being sort of androgynous, where you weren't sure if they were male or female, or perhaps both. In the movie, you have 3 Cenobites that are clearly male and 1 female Cenobite. Also, in the book, you very much got the idea that the Cenobites were essentially being controlled by a hive mind, almost like the Borg from Star Trek, but in the movie, the Cenobites very much have their own distinct personalities. The movie also introduced the character of Pinhead, who in the film is the leader of the Cenobites. Now, Pinhead is technically in the book, but he's much different in the book, and once again, in the book, the Cenobites are very much androgynous, so you're not even sure if Pinhead is male or female in the book. But once again, the movie very much gave Pinhead a distinct personality, and Pinhead has really become a very iconic character. Even though Pinhead and the other Cenobites really weren't the main focus of Hellraiser or the original novel, Pinhead really has gone on to become one of the most iconic horror movie characters of all time, with many people ranking him alongside other horror movie villains like Freddy Krueger, Jason, Michael Myers, and Chucky. But Hellraiser really is a classic movie, and it's a great adaptation of this book, but personally, I do not think Hellraiser needed sequels. Personally, I actually think the sequels kind of hurt the first movie. I think the first Hellraiser movie really should have been its own standalone movie, but unfortunately the film spawned a series of, in my opinion, inferior sequels. With the exception of the first Hellraiser sequel, Hellbound Hellraiser 2, which is actually a pretty decent sequel. It's not as good as the first movie, but it's still a pretty good follow-up to the first film. And it actually does really expand upon the mythology, while still leaving a lot of it very ambiguous. Now, the movie does make the Cenobites more of the main focus, which unfortunately did lead to, in my opinion, the downfall of the rest of the series. After that, you had Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth, which I think is complete garbage, and honestly, I find it to be kind of insulting to the first 2 movies and the original novel. And in that movie, they very much make Pinhead the main villain, but they turn him into your generic slasher movie villain. Following that, you had Hellraiser 4 Bloodline, which I actually do like a lot more than other people do. I mean, I get why people don't like it, but I've always enjoyed the film myself, and a lot of the problems that that movie does have actually were studio interference. Now, I have seen the work print of Hellraiser 4, and the work print is actually a lot better than the version that was released to theaters. Following Hellraiser 4, pretty much every Hellraiser movie from then on was actually a standalone script that was not written as a Hellraiser movie that the studio owned the rights to, and basically, when they made it into a movie, they just shoehorned Pinhead and the Cenobites into these standalone scripts. So, pretty much every Hellraiser movie following Hellraiser 4 was not originally written as a Hellraiser movie. So you had Hellraiser Inferno, which I actually do think as a standalone movie is actually not bad and is actually pretty good, but I don't think it should have been a Hellraiser movie. It should have just been its own thing. Following that, you had Hellraiser Hellseeker, which was just insultingly bad in my opinion, and it was pretty much the same plot line as Hellraiser Inferno, with even a similar plot twist, and Hellraiser Hellseeker also brought back the character of Kirsty, but the way they brought her back honestly was really insulting to the character and to fans of the character. Following that, you had Hellraiser Deader, which was just mediocre at best. Following that, you had Hellraiser Hellworld, which was mind-numbingly stupid. And after that, you had Hellraiser Revelations, which was obnoxiously bad. And it was actually so bad that Doug Bradley, after he read the script, refused to come back as Pinhead, and they had somebody else playing Pinhead in that movie. And the only reason they made that movie was because Dimension, who had the rights to the Hellraiser series since Hellraiser 3, were about to lose the rights, so they made that movie in I think only a couple of weeks, simply to retain the rights to the franchise. Now, they are coming out with a new Hellraiser movie, Hellraiser Judgment, which I'm hoping will be good, but I'm not holding my breath because apparently it's being written by the same person who wrote Revelations. So when it comes to the Hellraiser franchise, I really only recommend the first two movies, and 4 and 5 I thought were okay, but the rest of the series I thought was really, really bad, but once again, the first two movies are really damn good. There have also been various different Hellraiser comic books, and I think even Marvel did a series of comic books about Pinhead, but recently you had a comic book series that was actually co-written by Clive Barker, which actually acts as a sequel to the first two Hellraiser movies, and it ignores the continuity of all the other films. So once again, Hellraiser really has become an entire franchise that consists of movies and comic books, and it all started with this novel. Now, Clive Barker would use the Cenobites again in some of his other novels. For example, in Clive Barker's dark fantasy novel, Weave World, there's a scene in that book where one of the villains, who is a witch, summons the spirit of this man who was killed by these beings who she calls the Surgents from Beyond, and it's heavily implied that these Surgents from Beyond are actually the Cenobites. And also, in 2015, Clive Barker published The Scarlet Gospels, which acted as sort of a sequel to the Hellbound Heart, because it did feature Pinhead and the other Cenobites, and it also featured the character of Harry Dumar, who is another reoccurring character from Clive Barker's stories. Now, I liked The Scarlet Gospels, but my issue with it, though, is it acted as more of a sequel to the movie rather than the book, because the way Pinhead and the other Cenobites were described in that book was much more in line with how they were in the movies as opposed to how they were in the original novel. And also, another issue I had with The Scarlet Gospels is I felt like it made Hell much more of the traditional version of Hell, whereas in the original novel and in the original Hellraiser movie, Hell was depicted in a much more unique way, where you really weren't sure if it was Hell or if it was something completely different, but in The Scarlet Gospels, Clive Barker makes it pretty obvious that the Cenobites are demons from Hell. And apparently there is going to be another Cenobite novel entitled Hellraiser the Toll, which is actually going to be set between the events of Hellbound Heart and Scarlet Gospels, but it's actually not going to be written by Clive Barker. Like, Clive Barker, I think, is writing the outline for this novel, but it's actually going to be written by an author named Mark Allen Miller. But yeah, that's my review on the Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, and bye.